I don't think they can take Kharkiv. There's a number of things going on, a number of possible objectives. One is to move forward in that direction. If so, they already seem to be having some trouble.
But let's talk about the latest from the Russia-Ukraine conflict now. And hundreds of civilians were evacuated from the border areas of the Kharkiv region today amid Russian airstrikes. This comes as the Russian President Vladimir Putin removed his longtime ally Sergei Shoigu as defense minister. It's a rare reshuffle of his team and took many by surprise. Let's talk about both those elements then with Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman. He's Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London and a real expert on Russia wargaming. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor.
Pleasure.
Let's start, if we can, with Putin's move to appoint Andrei Belousov, a long-time economic advisor, perhaps not the person you'd naturally fit with defence minister. What was the thinking behind this?
Well, first one should say that Shoigu also had very little actual military experience. He gave himself lots of medals, but was basically a politician, whereas Belousov has got more genuine expertise, more technocratic, and it's related to, I mean, they've said that it's about bringing more innovation into the Ministry of Defence. This is now a war economy, and therefore the interaction between what is going on in defence production, procurement, calling up of manpower, etc., and the wider economy is pretty important. And he's seen as somebody who's going to be able to manage that more effectively than Shoigu. It doesn't make much difference necessarily to the conduct of the war yet, anyway, because Gerasimov, who's the military chief, is still in place. He may be replaced, but he hasn't been replaced as yet.
Some people have been suggesting that it's a long-term move and is to prepare Russia for a long-term conflict against NATO. Would you agree with that?
Well, Russia has moved on to a war footing. It did so during the course of 2022 and is now all in. There isn't that much spare capacity that isn't being used for the war. A lot of civilian tasks, civilian economy is suffering. Now, Putin talks all the time as if the real enemy is NATO and Ukraine is a mere puppet of NATO. I don't think he actually wants a war with NATO, but he's got himself caught in what is already a very long war with Ukraine without an obvious way to end it. So I think the best way to look at this is that this is for the long haul, and what the long haul actually contains is we can only speculate about. But I don't think it's a particular preparation for a war with NATO.
Okay. Let's talk about what's happening on the ground. Russia's advance on Ukraine's northern Kharkiv region. Kyiv saying today that Russia had achieved tactical success. There are fears that Moscow is aiming to go for its biggest breakthrough, really, since the early days of the war. They're taking advantage for a depletion in military equipment in Ukraine. That will soon be bolstered, of course, by the arrival of that US aid, but that will take some time. What is Russia's end game here? Is it anticipated that they can take Kharkiv, or will it be about doing as much to the outskirts of that area as possible?
I don't think they can take Kharkiv. There's a number of things going on, a number of possible objectives. One is to move forward in that direction. If so, they already seem to be having some trouble. It's very difficult to follow from a distance, so one has to be careful. But I think that certainly they've slowed down whatever advance they were getting and taking a lot of casualties in the process. The two other objectives, which are probably more realistic, one is to establish some sort of buffer zone, so it's harder for Ukraine to attack Belgorod, the Russian province next door. Another is to get into a position to hit Kharkiv, bombard Kharkiv, which they've already been doing quite badly, but they could do it with more accuracy and more ferocity. And a third is to, which has already happened, which is to draw Ukrainian reserves from other fights that are still going on elsewhere on the front line, and stretch Ukrainian forces more thinly. And I think that's probably the biggest risk to Ukraine at the moment. Not that they can't cope with this latest incursion, but in the process of trying to do so, they leave themselves vulnerable elsewhere.
Open in other areas, yeah.
And waiting for the American and European equipment is coming in, but obviously not as quickly as they would.
I was reading that there has been some public criticism among Ukrainian service personality and personnel, and cracks in the morale of troops as well because of this advance by Russia. I wonder if you've been hearing any of that as well, or whether that is something that can be overcome. Is there a chance here that that reinforcement for Ukraine comes too late?
Well, this is a very big country and a long war, and there will be ebbs and flows on the battlefield, and that's to be expected. I don't think either side is on the verge of a dramatic, decisive breakthrough. Russia is trying to take advantage of some advantages, which may be temporary, but are quite serious at the moment. The criticisms that have been heard have been of a lack of defensive preparations in an area where it was always likely that if the Russians were going to move, they would move. The counter to that is that a lot of areas could potentially be defended, and Ukraine couldn't do all of it. So that is why some villages had to be abandoned and are now being evacuated. And reserves had to be rushed forward. I think the morale point, I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that. Again, I'm going to stress I'm only reading reports. I'm not in close touch with anybody there. So it's obviously a blow when this happens. But the what's being posted today suggests that the situation is more stable. And the Russians have got a problem that they're pretty, when you make these moves and you haven't got any obvious places to hide, you're also quite vulnerable. And the losses that are being discussed, which may or may not be exaggerated, but even if they're a bit exaggerated, they're still substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ukraine today announcing the replacement of the commander overseeing the northeastern Kharkiv front line.
Yes, I think that's an indication that they aren't happy and that they feel that mistakes were made because they've changed the local commander. But that's being done now.
Really interesting to speak to you. Thank you so much, Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Great to have you on. Thank you.